Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started momentarily. Thank you so much for joining us today. While we're waiting for more people to enter, I know we have people coming in from not only all over the country, but all over the world. So please let us know in the chat where you're coming from. From the Catskills, welcome. Philadelphia, Colorado, New York, New Jersey, Krakow, Brooklyn. Wow, from Krakow to Brooklyn. Cambridge, Upper West Side. This is wonderful. All right. We're just going to give it another few seconds while everyone is joining. I have disabled the ability to unmute yourselves, but at the end when we have our Q&A, I will let everyone unmute, so don't worry there. While we're listening to Zachary's talk, if you'd like to leave questions in the chat, we can definitely get to them after the seminar. All right, I think we're going to start with our introduction. Good evening. Oh, not good evening. It's actually good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. But both good afternoon and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Maya Locker, and I'm the Programs and Events Coordinator here at the museum at Eldridge Street. Thank you so much for joining us for this seminar with Zachary Mazur. And thank you so much to POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews for doing this with us. I have turned on live captioning for accessibility, which is powered by AI, so please forgive any mistakes that you may see. Zachary, if you can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. Before we begin, I'd like to mention some exciting upcoming events that we have going on at the museum at Eldridge Street. For those of us who are new to us and to our programming, the museum at Eldridge Street is housed in the historic Eldridge Street Synagogue, and built in 1887. It was the first grand synagogue built by Eastern European Jews in the US. The grand building was nearly lost to neglect in the mid-20th century before the museum's massive restoration project returned the space to its former glory and to public use. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. I'd like to highlight our upcoming programming for a moment. We offer both in-person and virtual programming. Some of our upcoming in-person programming includes a panel discussion and reception this Tuesday, May 2nd at 6 p.m., all about author June Hirsch's new book, Iconic Jewish Food. Nikki Russ Fetterman, who's the co-owner of The Beloved Russ and Daughters, and this program's moderator, Roseanne Gold, who's a four-time James Beard Award-winning chef and author, are joining June in sharing their unique and personal New York food stories in a meaningful conversation about the city's culinary legacy. We are so thrilled that Brooklyn Seltzer Boys and Zaro's Bakery are sponsoring some delicious treats for us after the panel discussion, so definitely worth coming by for that. We also have Zoom programs coming up. The next one we have is on May 8th at 6 p.m. With Elaine Rosen, who is continuing her series Art History Through a Jewish Lens. This upcoming Zoom session will be about Nazi-looted art, which should be really fascinating. You can read about and register for all of our upcoming programming on our website, eldridgestreet.org/events. If you can move on to the next slide, please. Whether it's for a program or not, we would love to welcome you to the museum at Eldridge Street. We are located at 12 Eldridge Street in Manhattan's Chinatown, and we are open every day except Saturday from 10 to 5. And now I'd like to introduce Zachary Mazur. Zachary Mazur earned his PhD, at Yale University and is currently a senior historian at the POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. His research interests include 20th century Eastern and Central Europe, national identity, law, and economics. And with that, I will turn the screen over to Dr. Mazur. Thank you so much for being here with us. Oh, I'm sorry, you're muted.
There we go. I couldn't unmute myself, but
no worries.
We're all set now. Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Sophie Lowe and Bonnie Diamond for allowing me to do this and to talk with you. And thank you all for joining. So we're going to be talking today about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And I want to talk about specifically about the role of Jews in that society and in that country. And basically my thesis that I want to set up for you is that it was a good place for the Jews. It was a very, maybe even the best place for the Jews given the time. And we're going to talk about why that was, when that was, and then why it stopped being that way. And I don't mean to lead it, automatically to the Holocaust. Our minds sometimes go that way, but not in that sense. I want to talk about a little bit of an earlier period when things started to break down and why that happened exactly. So we're going to get into all of that. But first, we need to start with a little bit of geography. And this is a current map of Poland, of Belarus, Lithuania, and a little bit of northwestern Ukraine. And you'll notice that it has 4 dots, 4 stars on this map. And so this is not just geography, but this is also personal geography for me. This is mapping out the towns where my family came from. And I'm sure many of you joining with us today also have family from this part of the world. And you might think about, well, okay, so these people are from Belarus, these people are from Poland, these people are from Lithuania. Well, what does that all mean? That really means one thing. It means that all of these people lived in one weird place called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this is a picture of my family who came from Warsaw. The little boy there on the right is my great-grandfather, and he emigrated to the United States before the First World War, which is where my family came from, and why they were in the US. Well, we'll get to all of that. But before then, they all lived in this strange place called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And here's a map overlaying the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. At one of its largest extents, it wasn't always this large. The borders moved at different times, and there were different arrangements made. But this is essentially the area that it covered. And you can see that it's overlaid with the modern borders of Eastern Europe today. And so it covers most of Poland, but it's basically 5 times the size of modern day Poland. It includes a lot of Ukraine, even parts of Russia in there as well. So a huge territory. But we shouldn't be considering that this is kind of a centralized state, an empire that was centrally controlled in any way. This was a confederation of loosely joined together polities, and we'll talk about what that means and why that was actually a good thing for the Jewish community. So the Jews obviously didn't originate in this part of the world. They ended up there at a certain point, and the map that I'm showing you here are the years in which Jews were expelled from different parts of Europe. And so here you can see that throughout Germany, Austria, Hungary, and northern France, where many of the Ashkenazi Jews who settled in Poland came from, they were being systematically kicked out of areas, kicked out of towns, and then of whole principalities, and being told that they could not settle there. And then they started to move eastward towards the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So why did Jews settle in Poland, Lithuania? The simple answer is that there were little other places for them to go. They were, as I said, they were being removed from all these other places west of Poland, Lithuania. And the more complex answer has to do with the makeup of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So as I said, it was a loose confederation of principalities, essentially aristocrats, nobles. They owned large swaths of land, and within those swaths of land, they could basically decide any policy that they wanted to. So the kings did not have that much power in this system. And so what the nobles decided to do was to invite Jews into their towns, into towns that they actually owned. They were called private towns, and have them serve as merchants and craftsmen within their society. And we'll talk in more detail about what all that means. But just in terms of the structure of society at that time, we're not talking about a society that would be familiar to us in any way. There is no such thing as individual rights in this kind of pre-modern society, in this early modern era, there were privileges that were meted out to certain groups. And so with that, as I was saying, the nobles were giving privileges to these Jews, giving them the right to settle, giving them the right to carry out certain professions and to serve a certain economic purpose within their territory. So as I said here, all European societies before the French Revolution were grouped around these privileges. And that also meant that the peasants, for example, they were not free people at all, right? The vast majority of the society in Poland-Lithuania were peasants, and they did not have the same kind of role as Jews did. They were not allowed to, for example, to perform the same professions and role, but and so Jews actually in this society were free people. What did that mean? That meant that they could change their place of residence as they wished. They could carry a sword. They could buy and sell property, all things that, as I said, peasants could not do. Right, so throughout this period, with the establishment of these private towns where Jews were invited, what did the Jews do in these towns? They were primarily fulfilling roles that the noble had the rights to give away. So, for example, the noble controlled the production and sale of alcohol within his own territory. So then a Jew could essentially lease the right to produce and sell that alcohol. And that would be one way that a Jew would get involved in business with these various people. But they were involved in all kinds of professions as furriers and goldsmiths, blacksmiths and butchers and candle makers and all kinds of other crafts that were important for the economy of each of these territories. All right, so the Jews were also given the right or the privilege to govern themselves. And so there were a number of councils, and each local council had its own governance with the rabbi at the head. And it was a very traditional society in which Jewish law served as the law of these people, essentially governing all kinds of relations. And this also put them at the mercy of each other rather than at the mercy of the noble. So within Jewish society, it could operate entirely autonomously. And at a larger scale, there was also a council of the four lands. And so this brought together all kinds of representation for Jews within this society. So does this mean that it was a paradise for the Jews? Of course, not everything was perfect within the society, but there were a lot more opportunities for Jews within this society than there were in places west of Poland-Lithuania. So clearly, it was perhaps the best place for people to be at that time. And the photograph here is a photograph from inside of our museum, one of the galleries that is called Paradise for the Jews, but it's with a question mark. And so the idea is that people will explore some of the aspects of Jewish life at the time and come to their own conclusions about whether or not it was a paradise for them or not. So as I was saying, within the private towns, we get a number of kind of entanglements with the nobles and the Jews. And this provided them not just privileges, as I've said, but also protection. So the nobles saw them as being so important for their own economy that they would actually support them in lots of ways and invite more and more Jews to settle, which is how this process happened over a number of centuries. Here is one example of a private town, Zamość, which was founded by the Zamoyski family. And here you can see the main square and the town hall and the Zamość synagogue. This was apparently a very wealthy town at the time, and this is the way that it looks today. So you can see this for yourself today. So one of the most wealthy families during this time was the Czartoryski family, and I want to give you as an example the relationship between two people, Israel Rubinovich, who was a Jewish, essentially he was a jack of all trades for this family. He did all kinds of things. He was in charge of all of their affairs, and he traveled around to different places managing the affairs of the Czartoryski family. And the matriarch of this family was Elżbieta Sieniawska, who's on the right there. I should say that we don't actually have a portrait of Rubinovich, the Jew, in this story. So unfortunately, I took an image from the time. So this is just representative. That is not actually Israel Rubinovich. So I have to admit that my thing is false here. But in any case, it is a representation. But so just as an example of this this deep intertwining, Rubinovich was traveling around the country at one point. He was in Torun, which is another town within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and at that time he was detained for some debts that he owed. Who knows if it was real or not, but in any case, he was put into jail, and he writes a letter to his benefactor Elżbieta Sieniawska, who then raises hell and gets him out of jail immediately. And then she basically destroys the people who imprisoned her as revenge. So clearly he was important enough that he had to be saved from this situation. And my point is only to say that this wasn't a relationship in which the Jews were at some disadvantage, but were actually so important, so intertwined in the economy of this time that they could be really at an equal level or even at a privileged level in this relationship. There were also royal towns. So there were some towns that were owned by the king, and depending on who was the king, because the king was elected after a certain point within this polity. So depending on who was the king, they had control over these areas. And there were also Jews who were invited into these towns. So if anyone here has been to Krakow ever, I'm sure I heard that someone here is joining us from Krakow even, which is fantastic. There is a part of that town, a part of the city today called Kazimierz, which used to be a separate city, and it was a city settled for the Jews, essentially given to the Jews. So there were sometimes situations like this where there would be, the main city, the Christian city of Krakow, and right next door or intertwined with it a Jewish city. So that was the case with Kazimierz. And it is today still a site that many people visit for its Jewish heritage in particular. There are plenty of things to see there today. So here we have some photographs from a synagogue that was built around this time in the 18th century. And this synagogue was in Gwoździec. Gwoździec is today just south of Lviv in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine, a city that I'm sure many of you have heard about recently. And the Gwoździec synagogue was a fantastic building that was representative of a certain style that no longer exists, unfortunately. So this kind of wooden synagogue with these ornamental decorations on the inside. All of these buildings were quite fragile, obviously, but the ones that survived into the 20th century were destroyed during the Holocaust by the Nazis. So unfortunately, we don't have any of these buildings to go to anymore, any of these wooden synagogues. But this particular synagogue was so well documented and photographed, as I showed you, in the 1920s and 30s, that the museum that I work for, the POLIN Museum, was able to actually recreate it. And this is part of the exhibition, the main exhibition at the museum. You can see this recreated synagogue with the bima, and it even uses the traditional construction techniques. You can see the roof going through the building, and you can look at how this kind of architecture was built at the time. And it's a fantastic piece just of the time, preserving this time that is not accessible to us anymore. All right, so returning to some geography here. So since these Jews were living in a place called Polish-Lithuania, or more colloquially, just Poland, does that make them Polish Jews? And I would say no. I think that given the movement of people during this time, and especially given the national categories that we tend to use today that are so different than identities from this period, it would be wrong to call them Polish Jews necessarily. They were Ashkenazi Jews, right? And that came with its own set of traditions and things. But this map is to show you the movement of people during that period. So it was very common, for example, for people to travel to Constantinople over land or via the Black Sea. Traders would go south to Constantinople and then come back north through Crimea, moving from points north in Lithuania or further east. And also there were whole colonies of Jews, of Lithuanian Jews in particular, in Amsterdam during this period. And I also have an arrow going to Italy because that was the place that people would go for medical education. That was the place that many people traveled to in order to become doctors during this period. And just this map just shows the density of Jewish settlement in 1764 in particular. And the deeper the color, the darker the color, the more settlement there is, the more dense the population is. That's the word I'm looking for. So you can see that throughout modern day Lithuania, Belarus, and especially then sort of south central Ukraine and western Ukraine, that's where we see the most settlement. And the reason for this is, like I was explaining before, it has a lot to do with the noble relationship. So as the nobles were settling new towns, new private towns, they were trying to attract Jews to come to these places, and Jews were happy to settle there and then negotiate their own settlement. So they would negotiate whatever privileges they would want out of this and negotiate lower taxes or whatever they wanted to do. I didn't mention this before, and I regret it now, but the number of Jews who actually emigrated eastward from points west was actually quite small. When we get into the details, it's hard to say exactly, but the largest movement of people was about 50,000 people moving from points in northern France and Western Germany today to points in Poland-Lithuania around the 15th century. And then all of a sudden they end up with this huge community, as I'm showing you in this map. And so they had very high birth rates, and there are a couple of explanations given for that. One of them is that traditionally Jews during this period and even today to a large extent, they had systems of support for the poor. And Jews were very giving to these kind of charitable organizations, or the nascent version of that during this time. And therefore, people who did not have the means to support themselves would not starve or would not be malnutrition, would be not lacking in nutrition. And this was not the case with the peasants, for example. If a peasant was not doing well for themselves, then there was no system for them to gain more food and get out of poverty. The other reason for higher birth rates has to do with traditions of cleanliness before eating and bathing, and these were also not common among Christians. And of course, we have to put this in context. It's, bathing once a month rather than once every 2 years, right? So there is a difference between our own ideas of cleanliness and cleanliness during the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. All right. And so all of these things led to a rather a wealthy and learned society, and I want to talk a little bit about that now. The first images that I have to represent that are these portraits of Heike and Elia. They were painted by an aristocratic painter, Krzysztof Radziłowski, and these portraits are said to be the earliest known portraits of Jewish women from this region. The woman on the right was supposedly, I can't confirm this to be true, but she was supposedly the lover of the king, and the woman on the left is supposedly her daughter. And what we can glean from these paintings is that these women appear very wealthy, first of all, and they also appear very confident. And they seem to be powerful women, especially in the context of this 18th century society. There was also a very active book culture during this period. And yeah, the first Hebrew book was printed in Krakow in 1530. I mean, I don't mean the first book ever printed, but within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the first Hebrew book was the Pentateuch that was printed in Krakow in 1530. There were 2 active printing presses, and after papal censorship of the Talmud in 1564, there was further growth of Jewish printing within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Most people within this early modern society, so most Jews, I should say, most Jews could read Yiddish, and that meant that even the poorest of men and women could read Yiddish. It was not expected that women would read Hebrew. Most women did not read Hebrew. And then the learned among them could read and write in Hebrew, and only the elites would know Aramaic. Yeah, for some kind of access to this this magical learning that we'll talk a little bit about in a bit. The most popular book at the time, and this went through 210 editions actually. So starting from the 16th century up until the 18th century, so over a period of 200 years, there was basically an edition of this book every year. And that's quite amazing considering how expensive books were and how inaccessible they were in a lot of ways. But this particular book was hugely popular. It was called Senerene, and it was a mishmash of everything. It was called colloquially, it was called the Women's Bible, but it was really a mishmash of everything. It was not a Bible in any sense that we would think of. It was a little bit of Torah. It was some legends, some midrash commentaries, parables, and allegories. A lot of the things that are associated with old wives' tales and ghosts and things living in the forest, all that kind of stuff. That was the kind of thing that would be found in this book, and would be part of the kind of popular understanding of religion at that time. There were also, of course, many books published during this time that were of the much more learned variety, and we can discuss that as well. But this is a whole other topic. Okay, so because of all of this access to learning and printing and discussion and openness, there were movements that arose during this period. That couldn't arise in other places, and I think that it is because of this openness that we end up with things like Hasidism arriving in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth instead of somewhere else, right? So Hasidism emerged out of a hierarchy of society at the time. Before there was the Baal Shem Tov, there was a Baal Shem Tov, meaning that this was just a title in the Jewish hierarchy of the day, and these people were somewhere in between the elite and the common people. And so oftentimes these people would be serving as healers or as exorcists, as the case may be, and kind of engaging in lots of things that we might see as odd today in terms of the orthodoxy for what is part of Judaism today. but they were very important for comforting the sick, and they were obviously much more important for the common people than the rabbis who would not be so accessible in this society. Then there was, of course, the Baal Shem Tov, who is Israel ben Eliezer. He was from Mezhbish, which is Międzyburz. This was also a private town owned by the Czartoryski family, the same family that I mentioned earlier. And he became a kind of charismatic leader for this new movement. They were obsessed with different things. Let's say a kind of anti-establishment movement within this period. And so Hasidism was kind of a culmination of earlier trends, popular Kabbalistic ideas. This had a lot to do with the book that I mentioned before, Tzenarene. And then as this develops, there were certain teachers, rabbis, and tzaddiks who then became important regionally. And of course, this also had its opponents. So there were people, especially in the area of what is today Lithuania, who became very upset by this new movement. And they were known as the Bitnagdim. And they were also responsible in large part for the foundation of the first centers of learning, the kind of the officialdom, and then with that, establishing a kind of orthodoxy for faith and for Judaism. And the Vilna Gaon, who is the genius of Vilnius, as he is also known, is the main figure in this movement. And the basic outlay here is kind of seeing this as either charisma on the one side with Hasidism versus learning and deep knowledge on the other side, with the Vilna Gaon being kind of the main figure there. Then towards the end of the 18th century, there also began a third kind of movement, the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment. And the basic question here would be, how does one remain a Jew while also taking part in the secular world? And this becomes kind of the main question throughout the 19th century that Jews are asking themselves. As society is changing around them, as they find themselves less and less isolated and more integrated into majority society, into Christian society, how can they remain Jewish without losing themselves entirely? Or for some people, maybe they're interested in fully assimilating, or maybe even coming to the point of conversion. But of course, the ideal here would be to remain Jewish while still taking part in the rest of society. So this is happening. All of this stuff is happening. The conflicts between the Bitnagdim and the Hasidim, and the rise of the Enlightenment is all happening in the context of the partitions, the end of Poland-Lithuania. And this is sort of the beginning of the end of the traditional society that I was talking about before. This happens over a process between 1772 and 1795. Why this happens is a whole long other story, but basically the fact that Poland-Lithuania was made up of all of these aristocratic or noble families that had their own fiefdoms within the country, that did not bode well for centralization, for working together, for raising an army to stop the neighbors from invading, and eventually the country fell apart. And so this is the point at which we end up with Russian Jews and Galicianers and German Jews. So before this point, there were no Jews in Russia. In fact, Russia explicitly banned Jews from ever being within Russia until the end of Poland-Lithuania. And then there were all of a sudden, all of these Jews sort of absorbed into the Russian Empire. So since the Jews became subjects of these new empires, they dealt with entirely different systems of government, and all of the traditional relationships that existed before then started to break down. So in Prussia, for example, we get emancipation relatively early. mid-19th century in Austria, and for Russia, there is essentially no Jewish emancipation at all. And just to be clear here, Jewish emancipation is the idea that Jews can become equally legal with other people in the country without converting. And so this is a process that happens over a long period of time within Europe. The French Revolution causes the first Jewish emancipation, and then it spreads out into other places around Europe. And here we have just a map of the Polish lands under these three different empires, and you can see some familiar names. Here's Galicia with Lemberg. Lemberg is Lviv today. Warsaw, Krakow, Vilna. Vilna is Vilnius, of course, the capital of Lithuania. And these different lands become absorbed into the empire, and that is how Jews end up as subjects of these different places. And it's also how we end up with the Pale of Settlement. So I'm sure that many of you have heard of the Pale of Settlement. The Pale of Settlement was an arrangement made by the Russians to limit the settlement of Jews to only these areas, only these places where Jews could settle, and therefore they could not settle elsewhere. And this was a clearly discriminatory policy, along with many other discriminatory policies within the Russian Empire. There were restrictions on property ownership and also restrictions on the kind of professions that that Jews could fulfill or could serve in. And explicitly, some of the things that I had mentioned before, such as Jews serving as the producers or leaseholders of alcohol, or even the sellers of alcohol, and in many other cases, meat sales and other things, they were expressly limited and prohibited from serving in those professions, that had become part of a traditional relationship between them and the Polish nobles. And so this was clearly to break out that or break down rather that traditional relationship. And so we get an entirely different relationship, or rather we get a situation where many Jews are actually struggling to find employment. This is also a time of industrialization. So some Jews are going to the cities, they're moving away from their shtetls, but for many people, there were few options left other than emigration. And the first waves of emigration also coincide with the first waves of major pogroms within the Pale of Settlement. So after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in March of 1881, there were a series of pogroms that, and rather repression, that was meted out by the government. And at the same time, popular anti-Semitism was basically in its nascent phase, was actually becoming a political force during this period. And so over about a 2-year period between 1881 and 1883, there were 200 pogroms within this area. And there's been a lot of speculation, obviously, that there's a clear relationship between these two things, that the people who experienced pogroms then emigrated to the United States. But actually, Hasia Diner, who is an Israeli historian, she worked on actually trying to bear down into the data and look at this, and she figured out that that Eastern European Jewish migration was not was not solely caused by these pogroms, or really not even closely related, since many of the towns where people were leaving from were not the same places where these pogroms had happened. But she actually says that the issue was more about industrialization and how Jews were losing out in their traditional roles, and they needed to find new employment elsewhere. So the economic factors were bigger than the social factors, but that doesn't kind of explain the fact that many other migrants, Italians and Irish and Poles as well, Catholic Poles, were emigrating during this period as well, and they had a tendency sometimes to come back to Europe, right? In some cases, such as the Italians, anytime something went wrong in the US, when there was a downturn in the US, they would go right back to Italy. But that was not the case with Jews. So with Jews, there was very little return migration. So once they left, they had decided that that was the end of their relationship with this part of the world. All right. That's it for my presentation. I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Here at the end, I just wanted to say that if you're interested in genealogy, the POLIN Museum has a resource center, and you can email them and ask them any questions you have for free, and they will do archival research for a fee. You're also welcome to email me if you have other questions in the future.
Thank you so much. I'll just read a few questions that I received in my personal chat, and then we can open it up to questions, and I'll let everyone unmute themselves. Early on in your presentation, you talked about the town of, is it Kazimierz? Did I say that correctly?
Kazimierz, yeah.
Kazimierz. And we had a question about how most people are very accustomed to kind of the old city in Krakow, if you're accustomed to anywhere in Krakow. I personally myself have been to the old city in Krakow, and it was beautiful. But what were kind of some key differences between settling in that town versus the old city in Krakow for Jews?
I mean, the main difference is that they were just kind of limited in their settlement. They weren't allowed to settle within the other part of Krakow, or within Krakow proper, rather. There was a period actually when there were Jews in Krakow proper. On one street, I think it's St. Anne's Street was the Jewish street, was actually called Jewish Street, literally. And then in the 16th century, they made the decision that no Jews would settle within that town, and so then they were given their own town, which was seen as a privilege. That was, in one sense you could see it as being, kicked out, but in another sense it was Jews being able to live their own lives without interruption and without anyone bothering them, and being able to have their own autonomy, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
There were even cases. Sorry, just one more thing that's interesting here. There's cases in this kind of medieval early modern society where people were making laws that said, like, Jews can't settle here. Poland-Lithuania was one of the only places where Jews actually had their own towns and made laws that said Christians couldn't settle there.
That's really interesting. We have another comment going into the chat now where someone has a question about Polish Jews who immigrated to South America. Do you have any information about that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so especially actually in the 1920s and 1930s, the United States changed its immigration policy. It became much more restrictive, and there were quotas put on immigration from especially from Eastern and Southern Europe, and Asia as well, Southeast Asia as well. But this caused a kind of push towards immigration to Argentina and Brazil, and so those are some of the places where people started to emigrate to in larger numbers, especially during those years. But that started even earlier. Argentina was especially trying to attract people, and that was a common destination for people from that part of the world. All right.
Thank you so much. This was incredible, everyone. There's still more questions. I'm sure that folks can get in contact with more questions.
Yes, if people have more questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer questions.
And I can put all that information in the email that goes out later this week. Thank you so much. We're going to let you get some sleep. I know it's much later there. It's well after 9. So thank you so much for staying up for us, and have a wonderful evening.
Great. Thank you, guys.